In 1940, while bombs fell over London, a quiet mansion in the English countryside became Britain's most secret weapon. They weren't soldiers. They didn't wear medals. But their minds, their brilliance helped win the war. Inside Bletchley Park, thousands of women fought a hidden battle against Germany's unbreakable Enigma code. With pencils, radios, and sheer logic, they turned noise into knowledge and knowledge into survival. For decades, their work was buried under secrecy. Their victory never spoken aloud. This is the untold story of the women who broke codes and changed history forever. In the earliest, most desperate months of the Second World War, there stood an old country mansion about 50 miles north of London. Its name was Bletchley Park. Surrounded by green lawns and quiet lakes, it looked peaceful. Almost sleepy, but every window concealed urgency. Behind those curtains, young women in drab wool skirts sat at long wooden tables, sorting streams of intercepted German radio signals that arrived by motorbike each morning. They wrote down endless sequences of letters that seemed meaningless, yet each might hold the position of a U-boat or the timing of an air raid. The air inside the hut smelled of paper, ink, and cold tea. Typewriters clacked without pause, punctuated by the heavy hum of electrical machines testing millions of combinations. Outside, the sky often trembled with distant thunder from the Blitz. Inside, silence meant concentration. Few of them knew the whole picture. Fewer still imagined that their quiet labor in this sleepy Buckinghamshire house would shorten the war by years. To them, it was simply work, endless, secret, necessary, and it would remain unspoken for decades. The German Enigma machine was a small metal box with rows of keys, lamps, and rotors that changed position with every keystroke. It looked harmless, something between a typewriter and a puzzle, but it produced chaos. Every morning, its internal settings shifted across thousands of German units, creating more than 100 trillion possible encryptions. Messages intercepted by British listening posts were useless gibberish unless the day's key could be rediscovered before midnight. That was the nightmare facing the people of Bletchley Park. Mathematicians, linguists, and engineers spent nights chasing patterns that vanished by dawn. The work required minds that could think in spirals, not straight lines. They began to build bombs, huge electrical machines that mimicked Enigma's wiring to test possible rotor positions. But machines alone weren't enough. Human eyes, patient and intuitive, had to read the results and decide what made sense. That's where the women excelled. They saw rhythm in randomness, structure in static. And slowly, through exhaustion and logic, they began to make the impossible possible, turning enemy secrets into maps, warnings, and salvation. They arrived in small groups, stepping off cold morning trains that hissed against the platform mist. Many had no idea where they were going, only that the letter they carried bore a red government seal and the words confidential assignment. They were students, teachers, librarians, debutantes, young women with sharp minds and steady hands. Their luggage rattled with pencils and ration cards. At the gates of Bletchley Park, guards checked their names, then led them into wooden huts that smelled of dust and damp wool. Inside, they found long tables crowded with teleprinters, cipher sheets, and cups of cold tea. Some had studied German. Others simply loved crossword puzzles. None imagined they would spend the war breaking codes. Their instructors taught them the rhythm of secrecy, to listen more than speak, to remember patterns, to forget everything else. They learned to translate static into meaning, noise into warning. At night, they walked home past the darkened lake, its surface trembling under distant bomb light from London. Most were barely 20, yet their work would decide the fate of nations. When they wrote letters home, they said only, "I'm helping the war effort," and signed it with a smile they couldn't explain. It began with a mistake. A careless German operator repeating a message without changing the Enigma settings. To the untrained ear, it was just static and repetition, but to the codebreakers in Hut 6, it was the faint sound of opportunity. A young analyst noticed the pattern first, scribbling furiously in pencil as the others leaned closer. They compared, cross-checked, and realized that for a single moment, the machine's impossible secrecy had slipped. That repeated message became a map to the enemy's mind. The women worked through the night, feeding letters into endless columns until the puzzle started to breathe. At dawn, the lamps burned low, the room smelled of ink and fatigue, and the impossible had become clear. They had read the enemy's words. No parades followed, no champagne, only silence and another page of cipher waiting to be cracked. But for the first time, they understood what power sounded like, not in gunfire, not in victory speeches, but in the quiet certainty that knowledge could turn the course of war. From that day forward, they called each new breakthrough a whisper from the enemy, and they listened harder than ever before. Inside Hut 11, machines the size of wardrobes stood shoulder to shoulder, their drums spinning in endless rhythm. They called them bombs, mechanical giants designed to think faster than any human mind could. When switched on, they filled the air with a steady metallic roar, like 1,000 typewriters clattering in unison. Women operators stood beside them, logging results, wiping sweat from their brows despite the cold. Every flicker of a light could mean progress. Every jammed gear could lose precious hours. These machines weren't perfect. They needed intuition, guidance, correction, and that came from the women who learned their moods like living creatures. They whispered names to them: Agnes, Victory, Charlotte, because in the silence of those endless shifts, naming the machine made the work feel human. Each time a rotor clicked into place and the lights paused for half a second, a message had fallen open. Those moments, small and unseen, saved ships, pilots, and cities. The women smiled faintly, stretched their aching fingers, and carried on. There were no medals waiting, only another pile of messages and the hum of logic churning in the dark. Life at Bletchley moved on a different clock. Days were measured not by hours but by decoded messages. The women lived in shifts. Mornings vanished into nights, and weeks blurred into each other. They slept in drafty hostels, queued for ration meals, and rode bicycles through fog to reach the mansion before dawn. Inside, every desk overflowed with half-empty teacups and stacks of cipher sheets. Yet amid the exhaustion, there was laughter, someone sneaking chocolate, someone humming a band tune. They learned to find light in repetition. During breaks, they played cards on crates or read letters from home, never saying what they actually did. One girl confessed later that the hardest part wasn't the secrecy, but pretending she was ordinary. Every night, the air quivered with the faint sound of German transmissions, a language of threat turned into a rhythm of hope. They didn't know it yet, but their patience was bending the future, one intercepted signal at a time. The women of Bletchley fought a war without uniforms, medals, or battlefields. Their weapons were pencils and paper, their victories invisible. They sat for 12-hour shifts inside huts where frost crept along the windows and lamps burned through the night. When fatigue hit, they drank weak tea and pressed on, their fingers trembling over typewriters. No one outside those walls knew their names. Soldiers on the front lines never realized that the warnings saving their lives began here in silence. Once, a decoded message revealed an ambush in North Africa. The Allies changed course, and thousands lived. Yet when the newspapers celebrated strategic brilliance, the women smiled quietly and turned back to their keys. They understood that glory was for others. Their satisfaction came from the hum of truth breaking through static. To the rest of the world, Bletchley Park was just another estate. To them, it was the heart of a secret war, fought with logic, discipline, and unshakable faith in reason. Among the many minds working behind those guarded gates, Joan Clark stood out. Calm, brilliant, and impossibly patient, she had a way of finding order where others saw noise. A Cambridge mathematician denied a full degree because she was a woman. She joined Alan Turing's Hut 8 to tackle the naval Enigma, the most complex cipher of all. She spent nights tracing mathematical patterns by lamplight, her pencil worn to the bone. When others grew frustrated, she simply adjusted her formula and started again. Her clarity saved time, and time saved ships. Entire convoys crossed the Atlantic safely because of her quiet persistence. Turing once said she possessed the rarest kind of mind, the one that listens to numbers. To Joan, the work was its own reward. She didn't seek fame or even acknowledgement. She wanted only to finish what she started. Years later, when historians searched for her name, they found it buried deep in files marked top secret. But those who knew her remembered the same thing: the girl who heard meaning in the noise of war. Every person at Bletchley was bound by an oath, not to glory, not to country, but to secrecy. They were told that speaking a single careless word could undo everything, and so they lived double lives, one ordinary, one hidden. Families believed they worked as clerks or teachers. Friends thought they were typists for the War Office. The truth that they were shaping military strategy remained locked inside them. Even years later, when the Official Secrets Act was lifted, some still couldn't speak. They had spent so long guarding truth that silence became second nature. One woman recalled her fiancé asking what she had done in the war. She smiled and said, "Oh, nothing important." It wasn't humility, it was habit. The world moved on, but the echoes of that silence stayed. Their war never ended with a parade. It ended in quiet, behind closed lips, and the faint hum of a secret they never stopped keeping. By 1943, the rhythm of Bletchley Park had become unstoppable. Messages arrived by the thousands, coded in Enigma and Lorenz ciphers, and were broken within hours. Convoys reached ports safely, bomber raids hit their marks, and U-boats disappeared beneath the waves. The war had turned, not through brute strength but through intellect. Winston Churchill visited once, walking unannounced through the huts, nodding as he watched rows of women typing under flickering lights. Later, he wrote that Bletchley's staff were the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled. They laughed when they heard that, not out loud but to themselves. They had learned that the truest victories left no trace. As the tide of war shifted toward Europe, they kept working, decoding, translating, predicting. They were ghosts of their own creation, moving unseen through history, proving that even in the darkest war, intelligence could be the brightest weapon of all. For every code cracked, another day of exhaustion began. The women rarely saw sunlight. They worked in air thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of ink, their eyes burning from hours of staring at cipher sheets. Some fainted at their desks from fatigue. Others lost friends in bombings back home but had no time to grieve. The messages kept coming. One girl received news that her brother's ship had been sunk by a U-boat whose position she might have been decoding days before. She cried silently, then kept typing. Bletchley was both sanctuary and prison, a place where intellect triumphed and humanity suffered quietly. They told jokes to hide the strain, humming popular songs from London to drown the endless clicking of typewriters. Outside, the world raged. Inside, they fought time itself. Their greatest weapon wasn't genius or machinery. It was endurance. Every line of code they broke carried the weight of unseen lives, and they bore that weight without complaint. Years later, when medals were handed out to generals and politicians, most of these women were forgotten. But history, patient as ever, would one day remember the quiet soldiers of the mind. The nights in Hut 8 never truly ended. Lamps burned low over stacks of intercepted messages, the air heavy with dust and tension. Joan Clark, Alan Turing, and their team worked side by side in near silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the bomb machines. The room trembled faintly each time one of them whirred to life. Outside, owls cried across the frosted lawns, but inside was a different kind of wilderness, numbers hunting meaning. When a machine halted, everyone leaned forward. Sometimes it was nothing. Sometimes it was everything. One winter night in 1942, their calculations revealed the coordinates of a U-boat wolf pack closing in on an Allied convoy. The message went out immediately. 2 days later, the convoy reached port unharmed. The team said nothing, celebrated nothing. They returned to work as if saving thousands of lives were routine. In truth, it had become so. The war outside had its heroes. The war inside Bletchley had its ghosts. Unseen, tireless, and entirely human. Not every transmission reached in time. Some codes came too late, decrypted hours after disaster had struck. The women who read them felt the weight of each lost moment like a physical ache. One recalled finding a decoded message that revealed an attack had already begun, a convoy gone, hundreds lost. She stared at the page until the letters blurred into tears. But she still filed the report, stamped it, and turned to the next cipher. There was no time to mourn. At Bletchley, grief had to be folded between pages, hidden beneath the next line of logic. They were told never to think of outcomes, only of accuracy. But they did think always. Every message carried human breath within its cold structure. Sometimes a decoded phrase like "mission accomplished" sent a silent shiver through the hut. Whose mission? Whose loss? They never knew. They couldn't. Their duty was to make sense of chaos, not to feel it. Yet every one of them carried those ghosts long after the war had ended. In the beginning, many feared the machines would replace them. The bombs roared day and night, their drums spinning faster than any human mind could calculate. But soon the women realized the truth. The machines needed them as much as they needed the machines. A misaligned plug board, a wrong sequence, even a missed sound could ruin hours of work. So they learned to read the machines the way musicians read rhythm, by instinct. Some claimed they could tell a correct run just by listening to the tone of the motors. Others spoke softly to their bombs before starting, as though encouraging an old friend. There was poetry in the precision. Each click and pause formed a symphony of logic, a harmony of steel and thought. When the lights finally froze in alignment, a message was born, fragile and miraculous. They called it the moment the machine breathed. And in those moments, the line between human and machine blurred, two halves of one mind, united by purpose. Bletchley Park was built on secrecy, but secrecy also bred suspicion. No one knew the full picture, not even the commanders. Teams were divided by layers of clearance. People sitting beside each other might never know what the other was working on. It was safer that way, they were told. One woman recalled that her best friend in Hut 3 never realized she was translating her own messages from Hut 6. They laughed years later when they discovered it, but during the war, laughter was rare. Each person trusted the process, not the people. The security men patrolled the halls at night, checking that no document went missing, that no page left a desk uncovered. Even love had rules. Couples who met at Bletchley had to hide their connection. The greatest irony was that the people decoding the enemy's secrets lived surrounded by their own. Trust became a fragile luxury, replaced by discipline, dedication, and the shared belief that silence was survival. Alan Turing and Joan Clark's friendship was unlike any other at Bletchley Park. Both brilliant, both quiet, they communicated through patterns more than words. Turing, restless and abstract, would scribble numbers on scraps of paper and leave them on Joan's desk. Hours later, she'd return them solved. Their partnership was built on respect, one mind finishing the other's thought. They walked the grounds discussing mathematics, sometimes philosophy, sometimes nothing at all. When Turing proposed marriage to Joan in 1941, it shocked everyone, perhaps even themselves. But they both knew it wasn't love in the ordinary sense. It was an alliance of minds, a shared refuge in a world that misunderstood them. Though the engagement quietly ended, their friendship did not. They continued decoding, side by side, through the hardest years of the war. In a place ruled by secrecy, they found something rare: understanding. Not romance, but recognition. And in that recognition, perhaps, the truest form of connection two geniuses could share. After Enigma came a greater challenge. A German cipher machine called Tunny. Unlike Enigma, Tunny used teleprinter signals, making it far more complex. The Lorenz cipher that ran it was believed unbreakable. But the team at Bletchley refused to believe in the impossible. Led by mathematician Bill Tutte and supported by tireless women operators, they turned chaos into pattern once again. Tutte deduced the entire logic of the Lorenz machine without ever seeing one. His discovery became the foundation for Colossus, the world's first programmable electronic computer. The women who operated it learned to feed miles of punch tape through its circuits, reading streams of electric impulses like music. Each breakthrough stripped away a layer of the enemy's mind. Tiny messages revealed Hitler's strategies, troop movements, even his inner doubts. It was intelligence so precise that sometimes the Allies knew orders before the German generals did. The war was still raging, but the balance had shifted forever, not by bombs, but by brains. Colossus stood taller than any person in the room, a wall of valves and wires pulsing with life. It was hot, loud, and temperamental, but it worked. When the first successful decryption printed on its ticker tape, a cheer rippled through the hut. For a brief moment, war felt like progress. The women running Colossus became pioneers of computing without realizing it. They adjusted switches by instinct, memorized circuits like poetry, and repaired breakdowns faster than the engineers who built it. When something caught fire, they didn't scream, they simply fixed it. They were shaping a future they couldn't see, one filled with the machines that would define the world. Decades later, when people spoke of the dawn of computers, few mentioned them. But that glow, the first digital heartbeat, belonged equally to the women who stood beside it, sleeves rolled up, faces lit by the warm hum of history being born. Knowing too much can be a curse. The women at Bletchley read the enemy's secrets before the enemy's victims even died. They knew about raids, executions, betrayals, and could say nothing. Some stopped reading certain message categories altogether. The grief was too much. One translator admitted she would go home each night and write the decoded words into her diary, then tear out the pages at dawn. "I just wanted someone to know," she said years later. Knowledge, they learned, is both a gift and a wound. The power to foresee tragedy but not prevent it weighed heavily on their hearts. Yet they endured because not knowing would have been worse. They carried truth like a silent load, unseen but unbearable, and turned it into the fuel that kept them decoding. Their strength wasn't only intellectual, it was emotional resilience beyond measure. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. London erupted in cheers, church bells, and the sound of celebration. But at Bletchley Park, the air was strangely still. Orders came down to burn everything. Notes, diagrams, machine parts, all traces of their secret work. The women watched as their years of labor went up in smoke, curling into the evening sky. No medals, no recognition, only the satisfaction of silence. They walked out of those huts for the last time, past the lawns where they'd once eaten lunch, past the lakes that had reflected firelight during raids. The war was over, and so was their world. They returned to ordinary lives, to offices and schools, carrying within them the weight of something extraordinary they could never fully share. For decades, no one knew their names. But history, like code, always reveals its truth eventually. When the gates of Bletchley Park closed, silence followed them home. The women who had spent years surrounded by noise, typewriters, machines, and the low hum of logic now lived among quiet streets. Some married, others returned to universities, a few simply disappeared into ordinary jobs. None could speak of what they'd done. Their brilliance, their contribution, their sacrifices were erased behind a government seal marked classified. At reunions, soldiers and officers told stories of the front lines. The codebreakers smiled and listened. They had been part of the same war but lived in a different dimension, invisible and unrecorded. Decades passed. Children asked what their mothers had done in the war, and the answers were always the same: just clerical work. Only when the files were declassified in the 1970s did their stories begin to breathe again. For the first time, the world saw the quiet revolution that had taken place behind closed doors. one written not in blood but in thought. Those who lived long enough to tell their stories spoke softly, as if unsure permission had truly been granted. Some couldn't recall details, or perhaps chose not to. Others remembered everything: the smell of damp paper, the sound of spinning rotors, the feel of frost on hut windows. They spoke of friends who never returned, of laughter that kept despair away. Many still carried the habits of secrecy, lowering their voices when certain words came up, glancing over shoulders out of reflex. But there was pride too, quiet, dignified pride. They knew they had mattered. They had stood at the edge of history and pushed. One woman said, "We weren't heroes, we were workers, and we worked until the war stopped needing us." Yet history would later disagree. In truth, the world had depended on them more than it ever knew. The legacy of Bletchley Park didn't vanish with the war. It lived in mathematics, computing, and intelligence that shaped the modern world. The women who once fed punch tapes into Colossus went on to teach, to research, to inspire a new generation. Their methods became the blueprint for cryptography, cybersecurity, and machine logic. Without realizing it, they had built the foundation of the information age. In classrooms decades later, students would study algorithms that began on wooden desks under blackout curtains. Their fingerprints lived in every code ever cracked afterward. Even in the silence of archives, their equations still spoke. They had proven that intellect could outmatch violence, that the quietest people could change everything. And though their names were almost lost to history, their logic became immortal, living in every computer that hums, every message encrypted, every signal decoded. In 1979, a journalist visited the crumbling mansion of Bletchley Park. The gardens were overgrown, the huts decaying, the machines long gone. But when he knocked on nearby doors, the past opened. Elderly women invited him in for tea and told stories of sleepless nights, of laughter echoing through damp corridors, of names like Turing and Clark whispered like ghosts. They showed him photographs blurred, secret, precious, and spoke of work they had once thought would die with them. His article reignited history's memory. Soon after, historians arrived, archivists followed, and the silence began to lift. For the first time, the world listened. The voices that had stayed quiet for decades found their echo. The mansion that once hid a secret war began to reveal the truth, that victory had been born not in the trenches, but in rooms of thought, in the hands of those who listened harder than anyone else. None of the women at Bletchley saw themselves as extraordinary. They were ordinary people who loved crosswords, languages, or mathematics. And yet, their patience saved nations. That was their magic. They didn't seek fame or fortune, only purpose. They endured cold, exhaustion, and invisibility because the work mattered. Decades later, when museums displayed their names and faces, visitors were astonished by how young they had been teenagers, some barely 20. They looked fragile, but their minds had outmatched the enemy's most advanced machines. Their story proved that greatness often hides behind modesty, that the most world-changing battles can happen behind desks, not guns. The women of Bletchley Park were proof that history is not written only by those who shout the loudest but also by those who listen the closest. When memorial plaques were finally unveiled, many of the women were gone. Their children stood in their place, hearing for the first time what their mothers had done. Some cried quietly, others smiled in disbelief. The stone carried simple words. They gave their minds to freedom. No list of names, no rank or medals, just acknowledgement. And somehow that simplicity felt right. Those who survived never asked for recognition. They had done their duty, then disappeared into history. Yet standing there, beneath the gray English sky, one truth became clear. Without them, victory might have come years later or never. The crowd fell silent, as if even time itself were paying respect. In 2013, engineers rebuilt the Colossus computer from surviving blueprints. When it powered on, the room filled with the same warm hum that once guided Bletchley's nights. The lights flickered, paper fed through the reader, and the ghosts of history seemed to awaken. Among the visitors was one of the last surviving operators, white-haired, frail, yet glowing with recognition. She reached out, touched the machine's panel, and whispered, "You still sound the same." Tears shimmered in her eyes. For a moment, decades collapsed, and she was 20 again, young, tired, determined, standing before the machine that had once changed the world. The crowd clapped quietly. To them, it was a museum piece. To her, it was a heartbeat she had missed for 70 years. In the archives of Bletchley Park today lie boxes of unsent letters. Drafts never mailed, names never revealed. Some were confessions, others simple reflections written on scraps of stationery. "If you're reading this," one began, "then the war is over and I can finally say what I did." Most end abruptly, as if fear or discipline interrupted them. These letters are relics of restraint, testaments to loyalty stronger than ambition. They remind us that history is often shaped by those who choose silence over glory. The letters will never be delivered, but they speak nonetheless not of regret, but of integrity. Their authors knew the truth, that some stories don't need to be told to be remembered. Bletchley Park's story is not only about war. It is about what intelligence, humility, and cooperation can achieve. It's about women who were told they couldn't lead, yet led without anyone noticing. It's about math turned into morality, secrecy turned into salvation. In today's world of noise, their lesson endures, that real strength is silent, focused, and disciplined. The women of Bletchley didn't wait for recognition. They did what needed to be done and trusted that truth would outlast ignorance. And it has. Their legacy whispers through every encrypted message and every computer chip, proof that silence, when powered by purpose, can echo louder than any shout. When the last of the codebreakers passed away, their stories finally became part of history, not secrecy. The mansion still stands, restored and alive with visitors. In one of the huts, an old typewriter sits on a wooden desk, its ribbon faded but intact. A plaque beside it reads, "For those who turn chaos into clarity." Tourists walk past, taking photos, unaware that the air still hums faintly, as if the ghosts of logic never left. Somewhere in that silence, perhaps, another message remains, not of war, but of remembrance. It says, "The greatest code ever broken was not Enigma, but the one that said women could not change the world. And they did one keystroke, one whisper, one secret at a time." If you found this story as remarkable as we did, remember history's loudest victories are often written by the quietest hands. The women of Bletchley Park proved that intellect, courage, and persistence can rewrite destiny. Their names may have faded, but their legacy runs in every signal, every computer, every code still protecting the free world today. Like this video if you believe their brilliance deserves to be remembered, and subscribe to uncover more forgotten stories that shaped our world, one secret at a time.